picture the scenario, right? Because if you're sitting on their desk right now, I guarantee you have lived this. Maybe you are literally living it this very moment.
Oh, the universal pastoral experience. The silent panic of the study.
Yes, exactly. It is Thursday afternoon. The sun is starting to go down. The clock is just ticking mercilessly towards Sunday morning. And you are sitting there staring at a densely packed, incredibly intimidating paragraph in your Koine Greek New Testament.
And you've got the yellow legal pad completely covered in notes.
Right, because the most frustrating part is that you've done the work. You know. You haven't taken shortcuts. You've parsed every single verb, every noun, every participle. You've broken it all down to the absolute morpheme level.
You know your genitive absolutes from your periphrastic participles.
Exactly. You know what case, what number, gender, voice, all of it. And yet, despite all of that biological parsing data, you are completely, utterly stuck. I mean, you're staring at a pile of grammatical sawdust and you just do not have a sermon outline.
Because you have the pieces, but you don't have the picture.
Right. Why does this happen to so many of us? Because we're missing the forest for the trees. We have been trained to read the Greek text like it's a dead biological specimen pinned to a corkboard. We just don't know how the text breathes.
It really is the classic exegetical trap of the modern seminary, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, we are trained to look at the text with a microscope.
Yeah.
We extract the parsing data. We do these exhaustive lexical word studies, finding out what a word meant in classical Greek, what it meant in the Septuagint secular papyri. And we think, having compiled this massive dictionary definition, that we've mastered the passage.
But meaning doesn't just live in isolated words.
Exactly. Meaning is built through the architecture of the discourse.
Yeah.
So when you only look at the individual trees, when you're just staring at word-level data, you lose the connective tissue that holds the entire theological argument together. You completely miss the author's psychological movement.
And that connective tissue, well, that is exactly what this deep dive is designed to explore today. We are bringing a massive paradigm-shifting solution to your study desk. We are taking a deep plunge into systemic functional linguistics.
Right. Specifically, we're going to be anchoring our discussion in the really groundbreaking framework of M.A.K. Halliday and Hasan. We're looking heavily at their concept of substitution from Chapter 3 of their seminal work on cohesion.
And look, I know that term systemic functional linguistics sounds like a lot, but we're going to synthesize this high-level, arguably very abstract linguistic architecture directly with practical Greek New Testament application.
We have to, because the goal here isn't just to, make you sound smarter at a theology conference.
Right, no. We are going to blow open how you read the text, how you trace the biblical author's arguments, and ultimately how you outline and preach these passages on a Sunday morning.
The mission for this session is profoundly practical, even though the mechanics are highly theoretical. We have to bridge that gap between abstract discourse theory and the pulpit.
So what's our game plan?
We're going to explore how biblical authors, and we're really going to camp out with the Apostle John today, how they use this linguistic tool called substitution. And I want you to understand right from the start, they do not use this tool merely to save breath.
They aren't just trying to avoid repeating themselves.
No, not at all. They use grammatical substitution to create massive, earth-shattering theological contrasts. We're going to map this onto the Gospel of John and 1 John, and I promise you, once you start to see how these tiny grammatical counters are doing incredibly heavy theological lifting, it will completely rescue your exegetical process on a Thursday afternoon.
Let's start with the theoretical core then. Because, like I said, the terminology can sound intimidating, but the concepts are actually deeply intuitive.
They really are.
We need to define what exactly substitution is. Because think about how we're taught grammar in middle school. We are taught to use pronouns to avoid saying the same word over and over.
The classic example.
Yeah, you say, John went to the store and he bought bread. You don't say, John went to the store and John bought bread. So most of us just assume that is all there is to substitution. But Halliday and Hasan draw a very sharp, uncompromising line between what they call reference and what they call substitution.
Yes, and if we don't grasp this distinction, literally nothing else we talk about today will make sense. It is the foundational distinction of discourse analysis.
Okay, so break it down for us.
Let's define our terms very carefully. Reference, which is what you just did with the word he, in your example, is a semantic relation, is a relation of meaning. When you use reference in a text, you are dealing with total referential identity.
Meaning they're the exact same thing in the real world.
Exactly. John went to the store, he bought bread. The pronoun he and the proper noun John point to the exact same entity in space and time. Total identity is maintained. The text does not redefine anything new about the referent itself.
Okay, I want to make sure I'm visualizing this correctly. So reference is essentially like a mirror.
A mirror, yeah.
Like if I hold up a mirror to John, the reflection is just another way of looking at the exact same guy. You're just using a different linguistic angle to point at the identical person.
That is a very helpful way to picture it. It reflects the same reality. But substitution operates on an entirely different stratum of language. It is not a semantic relation of meaning. It's a lexicogrammatical relation of wording or form.
Okay, slow down there. Lexicogrammatical relation. What does that mean for the pastor with the legal pad?
It means that a substitute does not point to the exact same real-world entity. Instead, it acts as an empty grammatical counter, a placeholder that fills a structural slot in the sentence.
So it's holding a space.
Right. It forces you to presuppose an item from the preceding text. You have to look backward to know what it is talking about. But it is a relation of wording, not total identity. The word is carried over, but the actual thing being discussed is different.
Okay, before we get into the classic examples of this, I do want to push back on something from Halliday's framework that always kind of bothered me.
Yeah.
Halliday and Hasan also group ellipsis into this category of substitution. They literally define ellipsis as substitution by zero. Now, wait a minute, you're losing me with the zero business.
It's a common stumbling block.
I mean, how can a literal blank space, the sheer absence of a word, be considered a grammatical counter? That just sounds like an ancient author trying to save expensive papyrus, or, maybe just being lazy. How is silence a structural move?
I completely understand the skepticism. Grammatically, substitution and ellipsis are mechanically distinct, of course. Substitution uses an actual placeholder word like one or do, while ellipsis leaves a blank space.
Right.
But psychologically and semantically, they share the exact same relationship of presupposition. The text creates a vacuum that absolutely must be filled by the reader.
Give me an example of how silence demands something from the reader.
Think about a simple comparative sentence. If I say to you, I brought 2 books to the meeting, but the chairman brought 3. Stop right there. The sentence ended at 3. I did not say 3 books, but the blank space immediately following the word 3 creates a massive psychological demand. The text forces you to reach backward into the preceding clause, grab the noun books, and drag it forward into the empty slot. I see. The omission is grammatically loud. It forces a cohesive tie just as strongly as if I had used a placeholder word. So whether the slot is filled by a substitute counter or by a meaningful zero, the structural mechanism of presupposition is identical.
Okay, I get that now. It's a placeholder made of air, but its borders are rigidly defined by the previous clause. That makes perfect sense. So let's get to what I think is really the most explosive concept in Chapter 3, the engine that drives this whole theory. Yes, the concept of repudiation and redefinition. If you are listening to this and you want to preach better, just write those 2 words at the top of your notes, because in reference, like we established with the mirror analogy, total identity is maintained. But in substitution, the text carries over the core idea, the head noun or the main verb from a previous item, but it violently repudiates or rejects the accompanying modifiers.
That really is the magic formula of substitution. We summarize it with this phrase: continuity in the environment of contrast.
Say that again, because that is the whole ballgame.
Continuity in the environment of contrast. Substitution provides a structural peg to hang new contrastive information on. It carries over the foundational noun or the core action, but it repudiates the old context in order to redefine it entirely.
I used the mirror analogy for reference earlier. Let's try to map substitution. If reference is a mirror, I think substitution is like an injection mold at a plastic manufacturing plant.
Okay, I like where this is going.
You have a rigid steel mold, right? Let's say it's shaped like a toy car. You inject hot blue plastic into the mold. That's your first sentence. Then for the next sentence, you use the exact same steel mold. You carry the shape over, but you completely flesh out the blue plastic and you inject bright red plastic.
Yes.
The shape, the structural function is identical, but the material, the modifier, the color is totally repudiated and replaced.
That's a great analogy. The structure holds, but the substance changes. To use the classic systemic functional linguistics example, straight from Halliday and Hasan's text, think of this sentence. My axe is too blunt, I must get a sharper one.
That is the perfect simple illustration.
Right, let's look closely at the mechanics of those 2 short sentences. My axe is too blunt, I must get a sharper one. The word one in the second sentence is our nominal substitute. It is the empty grammatical counter, the injection mold. It carries over the head noun for the previous sentence, which is acts. But notice what it absolutely repudiates. It actively rejects the previous modifier. It repudiates the state of being blunt in order to introduce the new contrastive defining element, sharper.
Because if you just used a pronoun, if you used reference, you would be saying, my axe is too blunt, I must get a sharper it. That makes no sense.
Exactly. Or you'd be saying, I must get a sharper blunt axe. Also nonsense.
Right. The substitute word one is a grammatical mechanism that forces a rejection of the old modifier. Continuity in the environment of contrast, the concept of the axe continues, the bluntness is repudiated, and the sharpness is the new focus.
And that exact mechanism, repudiation and redefinition, is the primary tool biblical authors use to build theological arguments. They carry over a concept from the Old Testament or from a previous chapter, but they repudiate the old modifiers to demand a new ethical response, or to reveal an entirely new theological reality in Christ.
Which brings us to the monumental problem we actually have to solve today. This is all well and good for English linguistics. In English, we have these very convenient, very obvious little counters.
We do.
We use the word one for nominal substitution. I need a sharper one. We use the word do for verbal substitution. Mary sings, and John does too. We use so for clausal substitution. Is it raining outside? I think so.
Very simple.
But Koine Greek does not work like English. English is an analytic language, so word order and helper words do all the work. Greek is a highly inflected synthetic language. The endings of the words contain the data. So how on earth does an ancient Greek author achieve this exact same psychological effect of repudiation and redefinition when they don't have words like one or do?
And crossing that bridge between English theory and Greek syntax is where the lights really turn on for exegesis. As Greek is highly inflected, you're right, it rarely needs a standalone empty word like one to act as a nominal substitute. Nominal substitution in Greek is realized largely through the Greek article paired with contrastive modifiers.
Explain how an article can do that, because we usually just translate it as the.
In Greek, the article functions almost like a pointer or a nominalizer. So an article paired with an adjective or an article paired with a participle functions as the head of the noun phrase. The author drops the actual noun and just lets the article and the modifier stand in its place.
Ah, okay.
Substitution can also be realized through demonstrative pronouns like hutos, meaning this one, or ekenos, meaning that one, or through the intensive pronoun autos.
So the article or the demonstrative acts as the nominal counter. It fills the head slot. It carries over the presupposed noun class, but the new adjective attached to it repudiates the preceding modifiers.
Exactly.
This sounds abstract, so I really want to get our hands dirty in the text immediately. Let's go to 1 John.
A fantastic testing ground for discourse analysis.
1 John is notoriously difficult to preach. If you don't understand discourse analysis, 1 John feels like a theological washing machine. The Apostle John just seems to cycle through the exact same 3 themes over and over. Love the brethren, obey the commandments, believe in the incarnation.
It can feel very repetitive to the modern reader.
It feels like he's just saying the same thing in slightly different ways.
Right.
But he isn't. He is moving an argument forward, and he uses substitution to do it. Let's look at 1 John chapter 2, verse 6. This is a text every pastor has preached, and I'm willing to bet many have unintentionally preached it poorly.
Let's hear it.
Let me read the English, and then I want you to break down the Greek mechanics. The one who says he abides in him ought himself to walk just as that one walked.
Okay, the Greek reads, Holigon and auto menein ophele kathos ekenos peri epatetesens kai autos peripatein. Let's break down the cohesive mechanics here, because John is performing an absolute masterclass in nominal substitution and theological redefinition.
Let's trace the actors. We have 2 walkers in this verse. We have Jesus and we have the believer.
Correct. The demonstrative pronoun ekenos, translated that one, functions as a nominal head pointing directly back to Jesus.
Yeah.
He is the presupposed referent, established very clearly in the first 5 verses of the chapter.
Right.
Then we look at the second clause. The intensive pronoun autos, translated himself, acts as the nominal substitute. It carries over the identity of the believer, which John previously identified with the participial phrase holigon, the one saying.
Okay, so the nouns are substituted, but watch what happens to the action.
Exactly. The text carries over the core concept of a person walking. but it repudiates the historical singular person of Jesus Christ, aka to establish a moral parallel for the contemporary living believer.
Continuity in the environment of contrast. The concept of walking is carried over. The structural mold remains identical, but the identity of the walker is repudiated and completely replaced. The historical Jesus is swapped for the present believer. But to really preach this text, we have to go deeper than just swapping nouns, right? The nouns are just the surface. We have to look at the verbs. And to do that, we need to introduce Constantine Campbell's framework of verbal aspect.
We must, because this is where the theology truly leaps off the page.
Now, I'm going to stop you here because we cannot assume everyone listening has read Campbell's work on verbal aspect. For generations, Greek students were taught that verb tense primarily communicates time.
Yes, the classic tense equals time model.
We were taught that the aorist tense means past action, the present tense means present action, and the future tense means future action. But over the last few decades, linguists like Stanley Porter and specifically Constantine Campbell in his book Verbal Aspect, the Indicative Mood and Narrative have completely revolutionized how we view Greek verbs.
And it was a very necessary revolution, because the rigid tense equals time model breaks down constantly in the New Testament. You find aorist describing future events and presents describing past events. It creates massive exegetical confusion.
It really does.
Campbell, building the earlier linguistic theory, demonstrated that Greek tense forms are not primarily concerned with absolute time. They are primarily concerned with aspect.
And how do we define aspect for the guy sitting with his legal pad trying to figure out what to say on Sunday?
Aspect is not about when the action happens. It is about how the author chooses to portray the action. It's about the author's subjective viewpoint or spatial framing of the event. Campbell argues that Greek has two primary aspects, perfective and imperfective.
Give me a real-world analogy for perfective versus imperfective aspect, because those words still sound like jargon.
Okay, think about a parade marching down Main Street. If you were standing on the sidewalk right in the middle of the crowd, watching the floats go by, the marching band playing, the confetti falling, you were experiencing the parade from the inside.
You're right in the mess of it.
Exactly. It is unfolding in front of you. It's ongoing, continuous, and you cannot see the beginning or the end. You're immersed in the process. That internal viewpoint is the imperfective aspect. It portrays action as in progress. In Greek, the present and imperfect tense forms carry imperfective aspect.
Okay, so imperfective is the camera right in the middle of the messy action. What is perfective?
Now imagine you get in a helicopter and fly 2,000 feet above the town. You look down at Main Street. You no longer see the individual floats or hear the band. You see the entire parade as a single bounded line from the start of the route to the finish.
You see the whole thing at once.
Yes, you view it externally as a complete summary whole. You aren't focusing on the internal process. You are viewing the event in its totality. That external viewpoint is the perfective aspect. In Greek, the aorist tense form carries perfective aspect.
That is brilliant. Imperfective is the street-level view of the process. Perfective is the helicopter view of the whole, and Campbell adds another layer to this, which he calls spatial framing, remote versus non-remote.
Yes. The aorist is perfective and remote. It creates distance. It views the action as a bounded whole from far away, often historically past. The present is imperfective and non-remote. It brings the action close. It views the action internally, in close proximity to the speaker or reader.
Okay, with that vital context established, let's take Campbell's framework and map it back onto our substitution tie in 1 John 2.6. We have the historical walk of Jesus and the substituted walk of the believer. How do the verbs behave?
Let's look at the verbs for walk. First, we have Jesus's walk. The text says, kavos ekenos periepadesen. Periepadesen is an aorist indicative.
So, helicopter view, perfective and remote.
Exactly. John is viewing Jesus's historical earthly walk externally. He is looking at the 3 years of earthly ministry, the cross, the resurrection, as a complete, bounded summary whole. It is a finished historical reality. It is remote from the present moment. It's done.
Right. And then we cross the substitution bridge. We hit the intensive pronoun autos, the believer. What happens to the verb? The verb shifts to peripatanen, present infinitive.
And according to our framework, the present tense form expresses imperfective aspect and non-remote framing, the street-level view. So the believer's substituted walk is portrayed internally. It is not a bounded whole viewed from the outside. John shifts the camera. He portrays the believer's walk as an ongoing, continuous process happening in real-time nearness.
Consider the implications of this for a moment.
Mm.
Do you see how this completely annihilates flat moralism in your preaching? I have to ask you, the listener, how many times have you heard, or perhaps even preached a sermon on 1 John 2.6 that basically boils down to this? Jesus was a really nice guy who did really good things in the past. Try really hard to copy his behavior today.
Right, the WWJD phenomenon. What would Jesus do?
Exactly. But that is moralism. It is exhausting, it places the burden entirely on the flesh, and it is biblically inaccurate based on the grammar. If the Apostle John just wanted us to copy a past action, he could have used an aorist verb for the believer too.
He absolutely could have.
He could have said, Jesus accomplished a summary walk in the past, now you go accomplish a summary walk. But the linguistics prove we aren't just tracing over a dead historical figure. The shift in verbal aspect across this substitution tie proves that we are called to continue an ongoing living process, the present imperfective, that was initiated by and is firmly grounded in a remote, completed historical reality, the aorist perfective.
Exactly.
The substitute carries the DNA of the original but repudiates the historical remoteness to demand present, ongoing action powered by that historical reality.
It shifts the entire theological burden from mere fleshly imitation to vital spiritual continuation. The believer's ongoing walk is organically tied to the finished walk of Christ through the mechanism of substitution.
That is the power of discourse analysis. I mean, it preaches itself. Let's test this nominal substitution elsewhere. Does this hold up in the gospel narratives, or is this just an epistolary trick?
Oh, it is everywhere. Let's look at a brilliant use of nominal substitution in the Gospel of John, this time using an adjective that is turned into a noun, what linguists call nominalized adjectival substitution. Let's go to the prologue of John's Gospel. John chapter 1, verses 11 and 12.
Another incredibly famous passage. Let's set the philosophical context here. The prologue of John is introducing the logos, the word who became flesh. And it sets up this tragic irony of the Creator entering his own creation and being rejected by his covenant people. Verse 11, he came to his own, and his own people did not receive him, but as many as received him.
Let's read the Koine text. Aista idia alven kaio idioi oton uparelabon, hosai elabon auton. I want you to notice the cohesive mechanics here because John uses the possessive adjective idios, which means one's own.
Right.
In verse 11a, it is nominalized by the neuter plural article ta.
He's ta idia. He came to his own things, his own property, his own domain.
He owned the cosmos. Then in 11b, it is nominalized by the masculine plural article hoi idioi, his own people, the Jews.
So hoi idioi functions as a nominal substitute, filling the head slot for his own people.
Precisely. Now watch what happens when we cross over the punctuation mark into verse 12. The English text says, but as many as received him. The Greek word there is hosoi, as many as. Hosoi replaces hoi idioi. It is our substitution counter. It carries over the head concept. We are still talking about people.
The structural mold.
Exactly. We are still talking about a subset of humanity responding to the incarnate word. The mold is the same. But what does it repudiate?
This is where the contrast is just so beautiful. It aggressively repudiates the tragic, negative response of the previous clause. The old modifier attached to hoi idioi was oparalabon they did not receive. The substitute hosoi carries the identity of people forward, but violently repudiates that rejection, swapping it for the glorious positive contrast in verse 12, elabon they received.
This is the raw power of continuity in the environment of contrast. If John had just used a simple reference pronoun, if he had said, his own people did not receive him, but they received him, it would be nonsensical contradiction.
Right, it wouldn't work.
He has to use substitution. He has to grammatically swap the noun to establish a brand new subset of humanity defined not by their ethnic heritage, but defined by totally new contrastive action, faith. The tragedy of the Jewish rejection in verse 11 is the dark velvet background that forces the substitute hosoi in verse 12 to shine with the brilliance of grace.
That is just incredible. You see the tragedy and the triumph built right into the grammatical counters. Okay, that is nominal substitution, swapping out the noun to redefine the subject. Let's pivot to the verbs. Because in my experience, the verbs are where pastors get themselves into the most trouble. Let's move across the bridge to verbal substitution. What happens when the text carries over the noun but changes the action itself?
Verbal substitution is fascinating because, as we noted briefly before, Greek lacks a direct structural equivalent to English. In English, if I want to substitute an action, I just use the auxiliary word do.
Right.
I like dark roast coffee. My wife does too. The word does stands in for the entire phrase, likes dark roast coffee. It's incredibly efficient. But Greek does not have a direct one-to-one auxiliary equivalent for the English do.
Greek cannot just throw in a generic helper verb. So
Okay.
how do they swap actions?
Verbal substitution in Greek is realized largely through what linguists call pro-verbs. Think of a pronoun, but for verbs. The most prominent proverb in the Greek New Testament is ποιέω, which means to do or to make. It's a highly generalized verb of action. It's often combined with neuter pronouns like to this or ha, which to encapsulate previous actions.
Okay, and the other way?
The other primary way Greek achieves verbal substitution is through verbal ellipsis, which we discussed earlier, zero substitution,
Yeah.
letting the silence demand the verb be carried over.
Let's see, this ποιέω proverb in action in the text. Take John 14, for instance. Jesus is in the upper room. He is preparing his disciples for his departure. And he makes one of the most staggering promises in the entire Bible, John 14:12. Truly, truly, I say to you, the one believing in me, the works that I do, he also will do, and greater than these will he do.
It is a staggering theological claim. Let's look at the Greek. To truly understand the substitution happening here, we have to map the baseline data. We have to map the presupposed process clause. What is the original action before it gets substituted?
The baseline is Jesus' action. The subject is o Jesus. The lexical verb head is ποιέω, I do. And the goal, or the direct object, is ta orga, the works.
Excellent. Now look at the substituted clause. Kakenos ποιέσε, he also will do. The verb ποιέω is functioning as a proverb substitute. Think about what Jesus is saving John from having to write. Instead of repeating every single specific lexical verb that represents an earthly miracle, instead of saying, he will heal the blind, cleanse the leper, walk on water, multiply bread, and raise the dead, the proverb ποιέω stands in as an empty grammatical counter for that entire massive action class.
It swallows the whole dictionary of miracles into one simple word.
Exactly. The goal ta erga, the works, is carried over. But remember the cardinal rule of substitution. Repudiation. Continuity in the environment of contrast. What is repudiated here?
Two massive things.
Yes. First, the subject is repudiated. The actor changes from ego Jesus to hopis to on the believer. The power transfers. Second, in the final clause, the qualifier is repudiated. Jesus adds kai mezoner tuton, ποιέσε, and greater than these will he do.
The substitution provides the contrastive environment. We have continuity of the miraculous works, but a radical repudiation of the limits of those works and a total repudiation of the person performing them. It's no longer just the incarnate Christ. It is the Spirit-filled church. And once again, I want to bring Campbell's aspectual shift back into the conversation because the framing changes the theology entirely.
It absolutely does. In the presupposed clause, Jesus says, ποιέω present indicative, that is, imperfective aspect, non-remote, the street-level view. John portrays Jesus' works internally as an ongoing, active manifestation happening right there in close proximity to the disciples. They are watching the miracles happen in real time, but when the action is substituted to the believer, it shifts to ποιέσε, future indicative.
And how does the future tense function in aspect theory?
It's the expectation of the future. It technically combines imperfective and perfective potential, but the key is the framing. It frames the believer's future works as an expected, necessary, promised continuation of the same process type. Jesus' present reality guarantees the church's future expectation. The continuity is secured by the grammar.
I want to look at another use of verbal substitution that shows an even more dramatic aspectual shift, and this one involves a command, which makes it absolutely fascinating. Turn a page back to John 13:27. This is the moment during the Last Supper where Judas is dispatched to betray Jesus. The tension in that room is just suffocating.
It is the darkest moment in the gospel.
Jesus dips the morsel, gives it to Judas, Satan enters him, and Jesus looks at him and says, "What you are doing, do quickly." In Greek, ho poiais, poison takion.
The cohesive mechanics here are brilliant in their brevity. The relative clause or voice, what you are doing, establishes the presupposed process. And again, John uses the proverb ποιέω. It stands in for the shadowy, unspoken, horrific mechanics of the betrayal. Jesus doesn't say, go meet the Pharisees, secure the silver, and lead the guard to Gethsemane. He encapsulates the entire treasonous process into the proverb. Then, the matrix imperative ποιέωσον do substitutes for that exact same process counter, but it adds a contrastive temporal adjunct, takion, meaning more quickly.
Continuity in the environment of contrast. The betrayal is carried over, but the timeline is repudiated and violently accelerated by Christ. But the real genius here isn't just the speed, it's the verbal aspect. Look at the shift between the two halves of that short sentence.
The presupposed clause uses ποιές, present indicative, imperfective aspect, non-remote. John is portraying Judas's treason internally from the street level. It is already an ongoing, in-progress activity. The betrayal isn't some future thought. It is a present, festering reality in the room. Judas is actively betraying him in his heart at that very moment.
But then Jesus issues the command, ποιέω, aorist imperative.
Yes, aorist is perfective aspect, remote, helicopter view. Jesus commands the execution of the process as a complete summary whole. He views the action externally from his terminus.
Think of this like a film director on a movie set. The present tense, the imperfective ποιέω, is the camera rolling. The scene is messy, the actors are moving, the betrayal is fluid, actively unfolding in real time. But then Jesus, who is the sovereign director of human history, steps in and issues the aorist imperative ποιέω. He suddenly shouts, cut, print it, execute the scene as a summary whole.
Wow.
Jesus is forcing the ongoing, shadowy, fluid betrayal into a bounded, historical, divine necessity. He wraps it up and seals it. He sovereignly bounds the action of his own betrayer.
That cinematic analogy perfectly captures the theology of the grammar. The aorist imperative bounds the action, takes the messy, subjective present of Judas's sin, and turns it into a completed historical inevitability orchestrated by the Son of God. And here is the tragedy for the expositor. We only see that divine sovereignty when we map the verbal substitution and understand the aspectual shift. If you just translate it as, do what you are doing, you miss the sovereignty.
This is why we parse. This is why you spend Thursday afternoons staring at the legal pad. Not just to get a good grade on a seminary quiz, but to see the sovereign, unshakable control of Christ over his own betrayal. The grammar reveals the glory.
It really does.
Okay, we have to keep moving.
Yeah.
If nominal substitution swaps the noun, and verbal substitution swaps the action, what happens when a biblical author needs to swap out an entire universe of thought? What if they need to substitute a full, complex theological proposition?
This brings us to the macro architecture of discourse. Clausal substitution. This is where we see the Apostle John building massive theological arguments across entire paragraphs. Clausal substitution replaces an entire proposition. In English, we typically use the word so for positive clausal substitution, or not for negative. If I ask you, is it raining outside, and you say, I think so, that tiny two-letter word so swallows the entire proposition that it is raining.
It condenses the cosmos, it takes entire reality and squishes it into a tiny linguistic pill.
Exactly. In Greek, clausal substitution functions heavily in hypotactic environments.
Define hypotactic for us.
Environments of dependency, where one clause depends on another. Think of environments like report someone saying or thinking something, conditioned hypothetical scenarios, if-then statements and modality. In Greek, this is realized through conditional particles like a de me, which translates to if not, or cohesive adverbs like hutos, meaning so or in this way.
I want to challenge that with a text that always bothered me because it seems so clunky in English. Let's look at a negative conditional clausal substitute, John 14.2. Jesus is comforting the disciples. He says, in my Father's house are many dwelling places. If it were not so, I would have told you.
Let's read the Greek, because the if it were not so is a masterstroke of condensation. Ente oikia tu patros, mumanai pale, isin, idame apon an yumi. Well, let's map the presupposition. The presupposed proposition here is a massive declarative reality. Ente oikia tu patros, mumanai pale, isin. In my Father's house are many dwelling places.
That is a huge theological statement about the reality of heaven and the security of the believer. And instead of repeating that entire clause, instead of Jesus saying, if there were not many dwelling places in my Father's house, I would have told you, Jesus uses three tiny words. Eideme, if not.
Eideme is the massive negative clausal substitute. It functions as a black hole, swallowing the entire preceding declarative proposition and condensing it into a single conditional counter. It repudiates the truth of the previous statement in a hypothetical environment. This allows Jesus to immediately launch into the contrastive apodosis, the then statement, upon anhu amin, I would have told you.
And again, if we apply Campbell, the aspectual shift is doing so much work here to secure the theology.
It secures our hope. In the presupposed clause, we have the verb isin are, present indicative, imperfective aspect non-remote. The street-level view, it represents the real, ongoing, unshakable state of affairs in the Father's house. The mansions are currently actively there. Jesus is speaking of heaven as a present, vivid reality.
But the clausal substitute, I de me, sets up a counterfactual reality, a hypothetical timeline where the mansions don't exist. And the verb shifts to match that hypothetical nature, ipon on, aorist indicative plus the particle on.
Perfective aspect remote,
Yeah.
the helicopter view. The hypothetical counterfactual assertion is framed externally as a completed utterance that would have occurred in the past but didn't because the present reality of heaven is secure. The linguistics guarantee the theology. The present reality stands firm against the remote hypothetical.
Let's look at one more clausal substitute, and I saved this one for last because I truly believe it is the most homiletically powerful example of substitution in the entire New Testament. If you preach nothing else from this deep dive, preach this. 1 John 4:9 through 11. This is clausal substitution of a report or condition via the word hutos so.
This is a breathtaking passage. Let's read the English first to get our bearings. Verse 9. In this the love of God was manifested among us, that God sent his only begotten Son into the world. Verse 10. In this is love, not that we loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to be the propitiation for our sins. Verse 11. Beloved, if God so loved us, we also ought to love one another.
The pivotal word in that entire argument is so, if God so loved us. In Greek, it's hutos, agapetoi, ihutos, hotheos, agapes, and hemas. I want to issue an exegetical warning to everyone listening right now. Here is the trap I fall into, and I know students fall into. How often do we parse a word like hutos as just a throwaway adverb, a polite filler transition to get us to the next imperative verb? Yeah, God loved us in this way, yada yada, moving on to the command to love each other.
It is arguably the most common and devastating mistake in discourse analysis. We treat cohesive ties like they are just speed bumps on the way to the main verb. We blow right past them. But recognizing these as clausal substitutes prevents disjointed topical preaching. These words are the steel girders uniting massive blocks of theological text across paragraph boundaries. They carry the weight of the argument.
So prove it to me. What is the word hutos actually substituting here? How much weight is that little girder carrying?
The tiny word hutos acts as a gravitational black hole. It substitutes the entire complex reported event of verses 9 and 10. Think about what verses 9 and 10 contain, structurally and theologically. The historical manifestation of the love of God, the incarnation of the only begotten Son, the sending of the Son into the cosmos, the total depravity of man, not that we loved God, and the substitutionary propitiation for our sins. That is arguably the most dense, weighty theological proposition in the entire epistle.
And John takes that entire universe of atonement theology, all that blood and glory, and condenses it into a 6-letter Greek word, hutos.
He condenses it into a cohesive modal and conditional counter to launch the ethical obligation in the apodosis. If hutos, if all of verses 9 and 10 are true, then kai haimizolomen we also ought. The cross becomes the premise for the command.
And the aspectual waterfall here is just a masterclass in biblical writing. Let's trace the verbs through this argument from verse 9 down to verse 11.
We start in verse 9 with the sending of the Son into the world. The verb is apistalken, perfect indicative. Now, in our aspectual framework, the perfect tense form in Greek expresses imperfective aspect plus a state of reality. It is not remote. It represents the historical sending of the Son alongside its ongoing, abiding state of manifestation. The Son was sent historically, and the cosmic implications of that sending remain actively present right now. The fallout of the incarnation is still vibrating.
Okay, so perfect tense for the abiding reality of the incarnation. Then we hit the presupposition in verse 11, attached directly to the clausal substitute hutos, if God so loved us, agape sen.
Perfective aspect, remote, the helicopter view. John views the supreme historical act of love, the cross, the propitiation externally, as a complete, unified, finished event. The cross is done. It is a bounded historical reality.
And finally, we hit the contrastive apodosis. We hit the ethical demand placed upon the church. We also ought to love one another, O fellow men, present indicative.
Imperfective aspect, non-remote, the street level. John frames the believer's ethical response internally as an ongoing, continuous obligation in the present context.
Do you see the movement? It's a theological waterfall. From the abiding cosmic state of the incarnation, perfect aspect flowing down through the finished, remote, bloody work of the cross, aorist aspect, cascading violently into the present, ongoing, daily ethical duty of the local church, present aspect. All of it, the past, the state, the present command is held together by the clausal substitute hutos. If you miss the substitute, the waterfall dries up and you just have disconnected puddles of theology.
You end up with a theology of the cross over here and a moral command to be nice to people over there, with no structural link between them. The grammar is the link.
Which brings us to the ultimate payoff. So what? We have spent a long time in the deep waters of systemic functional linguistics, Halliday and Hasan's theories of repudiation, and Constantine Campbell's verbal aspect, but we have to explicitly bring this back to the daily grind of the pastor and the scholar. Why does the guy sitting in his study on Thursday afternoon care about lexical grammatical strata and structural pegs and factory molds?
Because, simply put, it dictates how you outline your sermon, and it prevents you from preaching heresy by accident.
That's a bold claim. Back it up.
The core takeaway from everything we have discussed today is the concept of continuity versus new information. Substitution in the Greek New Testament is never mere repetition. It is the biblical author's primary discourse strategy for anchoring given information, the continuity, while violently highlighting a contrastive focus, the new information.
If you miss the substitution, you miss the contrast. And if you miss the contrast, you miss the author's point entirely.
Exactly. When you see a nominal substitute, the author is giving you a new subject, a new actor on the stage of redemptive history. When you see a verbal substitute, he's expanding the scope of the action or bounding it sovereignly. When you see a clausal substitute, he's demanding a new ethical imperative based on a condensed theological reality. The grammar dictates the emphasis.
Let's role play that sermon prep session. Let's put this into a homiletical outline. Let's say you were preaching 1 John 4.11 this Sunday. Beloved, if God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. If you aren't doing discourse analysis, if you are just looking at the English text or isolating the verbs, your sermon outline is probably going to be 2 points. Point 1, God loves us. Point 2, we should love each other.
And let's be clear, that is a true biblical statement, but it is a flat, uninspired outline that completely misses the mechanical force of the text. It misses the waterfall.
Exactly. It's flat moralism again with a little bit of God's love sprinkled on top. But if you understand clausal substitution, your outline is dictated by the word hutas. Point 1 is the presupposed reality. Because hutas demands you look backward, your first point has to be verses 9 and 10. You have to preach the incarnation and the propitiation, because that is the mass that hutas is carrying in its structural mold. You preach the perfect and aorist realities, the abiding incarnation and the finished cross.
Point 2 is the cohesive counter. You preach the so. You preach the hukas itself. You explain to your congregation how the massive weight of the cross is condensed and placed into the conditional if. You explain how the historical reality of propitiation becomes the literal engine for personal transformation. The cross isn't just something that happened. It is the structural premise for everything we do today.
And point 3 is the contrastive apodosis, the ethical demand. You preach the present tense ophelomen, the ongoing, relentless, imperfective, street-level obligation to love the brethren, which is only possible because of the repudiation of our old nature by the cross. You don't have to manufacture an outline. The Apostle John gave you the outline in his grammatical structure.
This methodology fundamentally prevents exegetical fallacies. You can no longer preach a verb in isolation. You can no longer just look up a Greek word in a lexicon, find a cool nuance in the dictionary definition, and build a 3-point sermon around a definition. You have to ask the structural questions. What is this word carrying over, and what is this word repudiating?
Continuity in the environment of contrast. That phrase alone is worth the price of admission today. It forces you to read the text forward and backward simultaneously. It forces you to view the paragraph as a living, breathing organism.
And that is the brilliance of synthesizing Halliday's secular linguistics with Campbell's verbal aspect. It allows the exegete to watch the Apostle John's mind transition seamlessly between historical, remote objective truths, ongoing internal subjective experiences. You are literally tracking the psychological and theological movement of the author at the level of the clause. You are thinking his thoughts after him.
It is breathtaking when you actually see it working on the page. You stop seeing sawdust and you start seeing a cathedral. We need to wrap this up. We have covered an immense amount of ground today. The core thesis here is that Halliday and Hasan's framework of substitution shifts our perspective entirely. We have to stop looking at the Greek text as a dead biological specimen pinned to a board. We have to start reading it as a living artifact of meaning. Every grammatical counter, every article, every pronoun, every hutas and me is doing heavy theological lifting.
When you respect the grammar, the theology reveals itself. Substitution is the architecture of repudiation and redefinition. It is how the biblical authors move us from the old to the new, from the historical reality to the present demand.
I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over as you head back to your study and stare at that legal pad. We have been talking about substitution at the grammatical level, how a specific word requires repudiation to establish a new contrastive reality. But what if we zoom out? What if we apply systemic functional linguistics to biblical theology as a whole? How might we view the overarching structure of the entire New Testament as a macro-level substitution of the Old Covenant? Think about it. The core promises the structural mold. The head are carried over. The promise of a kingdom, a priest, a sacrifice, continuity. But the old modifiers, the physical temple in Jerusalem, the Levitical priesthood, the blood of bulls and goats, are violently repudiated to make way for the ultimate contrastive focus. Christ himself. The ultimate fulfillment, the ultimate redefinition. Think about that the next time you open your Koine Greek New Testament. Until next time, keep digging deep.